You can gain money, status, and recognition and still be trapped. Solomon warned about this thousands of years ago. Naval Ravikant repeats the same warning today. In this video, you'll understand what true wealth is in an addicted world, and why so many successful men feel tired, anxious, and empty. Subscribe and stay until the end. This could change your direction. There is a quiet unease that follows many men in the 21st century. They work, produce, consume information, seek recognition, and still feel that something inside them isn't coming together. This isn't about laziness or lack of ability. It's confusion about what is truly worth pursuing. The word wealth has come to mean many things at once, but it has lost precision. When everything seems like wealth, nothing truly guides our choices. The wisdom tradition associated with Solomon emerges precisely at this point of confusion. It was not born in a simple world, but in a context of power, abundance, political alliances, and excess. Ancient wisdom did not warn against work or prosperity, but against the loss of discernment. When a man can no longer distinguish what strengthens him from what merely distracts him, he begins to accumulate without direction. The result is not fulfillment, but inner fragmentation. Centuries later, Naval Ravikant observes the same phenomenon using different language. The modern world does not suffer from a lack of opportunities, but from an excess of stimuli. The human mind, however, did not evolve to handle so many immediate rewards. The brain prefers comfort over truth, quick pleasure over slow construction. When clarity is missing, the freedom promised by wealth turns into disguised dependence. People work a lot, but live very little. This helps explain why so many intelligent men find themselves trapped in weakening habits. It's not ignorance, it's dissonance. When values and behaviors conflict, the mind looks for justifications to preserve the habit and avoid change. Denying the problem often feels easier than taking responsibility for facing it. That's how silent addictions arise. Pornography, gambling, overeating, constant distraction. They don't appear as bad choices, but as momentary relief. Developmental psychology shows that emotional maturity is not automatic. Many men grow professionally, but remain immature in managing their own lives. Avoiding discomfort becomes routine. Pleasure takes the place of meaning. Viktor Frankl observed that when a man cannot find purpose, he seeks compensation. The problem is that compensations relieve, but they do not sustain. Over time, they demand a high price in energy, focus, and dignity. The symbolic figure of Solomon represents the oldest warning about this risk. He is not a modern author, but an archetype that concentrates human experience with power and excess. The wisdom attributed to this tradition insists on one point: wealth without inner governance leads to disorder. The problem was never having a lot, but losing mastery over oneself. When pleasure takes command, character weakens. Naval Ravikant translates this same idea into the present by stating that true wealth is freedom. Freedom of time, of coercion, of compulsions. A man can make money and still be a slave to his impulses. He can be admired and yet unable to take care of his own home, his wife, his parents, or his mental health. Professional respect is born not only from technical competence, but from moral reliability. This is where the concept of a contemporary Solomon emerges, a man who seeks to prosper without losing his center, who understands that discipline is not punishment, but protection, who knows that change hurts, but staying where you are costs more. In a world addicted to distraction, taking radical responsibility for one's own life is a quiet act of courage. This journey begins when wealth stops being an empty label and becomes, once again, a measure of clarity, character, and sustained direction over time. The figure of Solomon occupies a singular place in the history of human thought. He should not be understood merely as a specific king, nor as an author in the modern sense, but as a composite figure built from the collective memory of a period in which power, wealth, and wisdom walked together, and later came into tension. Historians, theologians, and scholars agree that the tradition associated with Solomon gathers real experiences of governance, political alliances, economic prosperity, and, above all, the internal risks that arise when a man loses mastery over himself. In the Hebrew wisdom tradition, wisdom was never presented as mere intellectual knowledge. It was always tied to the ability to discern limits, order desires, and take responsibility for the consequences of one's choices. Power, in this context, was not seen as neutral. The greater the authority, the greater the demand for inner maturity. This association between wisdom, power, and responsibility appears repeatedly because it reflects a truth observed across generations. External growth tests character before it rewards it. Solomon symbolizes the man who achieves everything many desire: influence, recognition, material abundance, and international prestige. Yet the very tradition that exalts him also preserves the warning. The problem was never prosperity itself, but excess without inner governance. When pleasure ceases to be a consequence and becomes an end, dispersion follows. A man begins to accumulate experiences, possessions, and stimuli without integration. On the outside, there is success. On the inside, disorder. This pattern has been analyzed by many thinkers throughout history. Aristotle argued that virtue is born not from talent or position, but from habit. Without the constant practice of self-mastery, even the most privileged man strays. The Solomonic tradition echoes this idea by showing that wisdom does not maintain itself automatically. It requires vigilance. When vigilance fails, character fragments and power amplifies fragility instead of correcting it. Søren Kierkegaard, reflecting on existential emptiness, observed that excess can produce silent despair. When a man tries to fill life with pleasure, status, or experiences, but not with meaning, an unrest arises that cannot be resolved with more stimulation. This helps explain the symbolic fall associated with Solomon. It is not an immediate political collapse, but a gradual inner weakening. Dispersion precedes ruin. Modern scholars who study the figure of Solomon highlight exactly this point. Whether understood as a historical king, a literary archetype, or a fusion of different rulers from the past, the value of the tradition lies in the human pattern it reveals. Wealth without self-mastery does not generate freedom. It generates dependence. Power without clarity does not strengthen. It amplifies deviation. Wisdom, when detached from character, loses its protective function. The wisdom tradition insists that governing oneself is harder than governing peoples. This principle has crossed centuries because it remains current. A man who does not organize his desires, habits, and internal limits ends up being led by external impulses. Pleasure begins to dictate choices. Excess becomes routine. The mind loses focus. Life loses direction. This process is rarely noticed at the beginning. It settles in gradually, almost comfortably. Solomon, as a symbol, represents precisely this warning. The fall does not begin with large, visible errors, but with small, repeated concessions. Wisdom ceases to be daily practice and becomes empty speech. Accumulation replaces discernment. The man remains powerful, but he is no longer whole. This reading does not condemn ambition. It redefines its axis. True wealth, according to the Solomonic tradition, is not measured by how much one possesses, but by how much one governs. Where there is self-mastery, there is order. Where it is lacking, excess always collects its price, sooner or later, inevitably. Against this backdrop, if Solomon represents ancestral wisdom in the face of power and excess, Naval Ravikant appears as a contemporary counterpoint, quiet and deliberately opposed to the modern imaginary of success. He does not occupy this role as a guru or charismatic leader, but as a thinker who observes human patterns in an accelerated world. His reflection begins with a simple observation. There have never been so many opportunities to generate wealth, And yet it has never been so common to find men who are financially successful but internally exhausted and restless. Naval introduces a fundamental distinction between generic wealth and specific wealth. Generic wealth depends on direct competition, status, and external validation. It requires constant comparison and keeps a man trapped in endless cycles of effort and anxiety. Specific wealth, on the other hand, is born from mastery of unique skills, the creation of real value, and autonomy over one's own time. This distinction helps explain why many men make money but do not gain freedom. They accumulate resources, yet remain subordinate to external pressures, others' expectations, and routines they do not control. This perspective echoes an ancient biblical proverb that says, "Better is little with rest than much with restlessness." Ancient wisdom already pointed out that the problem is not quantity, but internal cost. Naval translates this idea into the present by stating that freedom is the absence of coercion. It's not just about money, but about reducing unnecessary obligations, empty commitments and stimuli that fragment the mind. A man can earn well and still live imprisoned by choices he never re-examined. Radical responsibility occupies a central place in Naval's thinking. He argues that no one is responsible for a man's life except the man himself. This statement carries no moral harshness, but practical clarity. When an individual shifts blame to the system, the family or society, he gives up the only space where he can act, his own behavior. Motivation psychology confirms that men who assume internal control show greater capacity for change and less dependence on immediate rewards. Naval also becomes a quiet critic of modern addiction to status, pleasure, and distraction. He observes that the attention economy has turned stimuli into commodities and men into dopamine consumers. Social media, endless entertainment, and quick rewards compete directly with focus and depth. The brain, naturally inclined toward comfort, chooses the easier path. Daniel Kahneman showed that fast, impulsive decisions dominate when cognitive effort is avoided. The result is a busy life, but a shallow one. In this context, many men confuse movement with progress. They work more, consume more information, and distract themselves more, believing this brings them closer to success. Yet peace does not follow that pace. Modern work sociology shows that the loss of boundaries between personal and professional time generates chronic anxiety. Naval responds with an almost countercultural proposal: less, but better. Fewer stimuli, fewer empty commitments, less comparison, more clarity, more focus, more autonomy. There is also an implicit ethical dimension to this view. An ancient proverb says that he who lacks self-control is like a city without walls. Naval doesn't use that language, but he expresses the same idea when he argues that self-knowledge precedes sustainable success. Without understanding one's own impulses, desires, and limits, a man becomes vulnerable to anything that promises immediate relief. The absence of self-mastery does not prevent financial gain, but it compromises the ability to enjoy it. That is why the central question is not how much a man earns, but how much control he has over his own life. Many achieve material comfort, yet remain trapped in routines they despise, habits that weaken them, and expectations they never consciously chose. Naval does not advocate asceticism or withdrawal from the world. It's not about living with less out of obligation or rejecting progress, but about freeing oneself from what enslaves. What he proposes is alignment. True wealth, in his view, is reducing internal noise and living with greater coherence between values, choices, and actions. This approach does not deny ambition, it repositions it. Ambition without clarity produces restlessness. Ambition with responsibility produces freedom. When this thinking is placed alongside ancestral wisdom, it becomes clear that the issue spans centuries. The modern man faces the same ancient dilemmas, only with more stimuli. Naval Ravikant does not replace Solomon. He updates the warning: wealth that does not liberate imprisons. And freedom begins when a man chooses to govern himself before trying to conquer the world. This realization creates an inevitable point of tension. If true wealth depends on inner governance, then the problem lies not only in the excess of modern stimuli, but in the fragility with which many men deal with them. The question stops being theoretical and becomes structural. What sustains a man when everything around him invites dispersion? It is here that the comparison between the ancestral wisdom associated with Solomon and the contemporary philosophy of Naval Ravikant stops being parallel and becomes convergent. Both point to the same silent foundation. Without inner power, any form of success becomes unstable. When we look closely at the wisdom tradition associated with Solomon and the contemporary thought of Naval Ravikant, it becomes clear that both converge on the same axis. External power is only sustainable when inner power exists. This idea crosses centuries because it touches a sensitive point of human experience. No matter the era, the technology, or the level of available wealth, when a man does not govern himself, everything he conquers ends up governing him. Historian Paul Johnson, analyzing great leaders and intellectuals, observed that power does not create virtues or flaws. It only amplifies them. Where there is character, power strengthens. Where there is fragility, it accelerates the fall. This helps explain why ancient wisdom insisted so strongly on self-mastery. Solomon, as a composite figure, represents exactly this dilemma. Abundance and prestige did not prevent dispersion when inner vigilance weakened. Naval Ravikant describes the same phenomenon in modern language by stating that wealth without freedom is simply a more sophisticated form of slavery. The modern world adds an aggravating factor. It has never been easier to lose inner power without noticing. Modern addictions rarely present themselves as destructive at first. They appear as relief, distraction, or reward. Pornography, gaming, overeating, and constant stimulation offer immediate pleasure, but demand focus, mental energy, and clarity over time. The neuroscience of attention shows that a brain exposed to quick rewards reduces its capacity for deep concentration. A man begins to react more than decide. At that point, inner power starts to dissolve. Roy Baumeister, in his studies on self-control, showed that it functions like a limited but trainable resource. When an individual repeatedly gives in to impulses, his capacity for conscious choice weakens. The problem is not only moral or behavioral, it is structural. The mind becomes accustomed to the easiest path. Discipline stops being exercised. Solomon warned that a spirit without self-control is like a city without walls. Naval translates this by saying that without internal control, a man becomes predictable and manipulable. Another point of convergence between these two views is the relationship between wealth and anxiety. When success is not aligned with clear values, it produces restlessness rather than peace. Many men achieve financial stability, but live under pressure from external expectations, constant comparison, and fear of losing status. In this case, wealth amplifies inner tension. The wisdom tradition already pointed out that excess without discernment produces unease. Naval reinforces that the absence of clarity turns opportunities into sources of exhaustion. This is the invisible cost of poorly directed success. It doesn't show up immediately as financial or social loss, but as silent symptoms: constant irritability, chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, emotional distance from family, and a gradual loss of meaning. The man keeps functioning, but he is no longer whole. Paul Johnson observed that many historical collapses began exactly this way, not from a lack of resources, but from internal failures of character and direction. Personal responsibility emerges then as the common antidote in both traditions, not in the sense of excessive guilt, but in taking ownership of what can be controlled. Naval argues for radical responsibility because he understands that freedom begins when a man stops outsourcing his decisions. Ancient wisdom points in the same direction by affirming that every choice carries unavoidable consequences. Where responsibility exists, adjustment is possible. Where it is absent, excess takes over. This meeting point reveals an uncomfortable truth. True wealth is not what is accumulated, but what is not lost when circumstances change. Inner power protects a man in any scenario. It sustains focus, preserves relationships, and maintains dignity under pressure. Solomon and Naval, each in his own way, show that the greatest risk is not wanting to prosper, but prospering without self-mastery. In a world of excess, governing oneself remains the highest form of wealth, capable of sustaining a coherent, free life, guided by conscious choices over time. When it becomes clear that inner power is what sustains any form of wealth, reflection is no longer comfortable. It can no longer remain in the realm of ideas or historical figures. It descends into everyday life, into real routines, into the habits repeated when no one is watching. That is where the concept of wealth turns into a mirror. The question stops being abstract. It is no longer about whether one prospers, but about how one lives while trying to prosper. True wealth does not appear as an isolated event or a single achievement. It is built through daily, almost invisible choices made within the ordinary rhythm of life. Behavioral psychology shows that the human brain is not transformed by occasional big decisions, but by repeated patterns. Every routine sets a direction, every concession creates a precedent. Over time, these accumulated choices shape character, focus, and direction. This is where clarity becomes decisive. When a man does not precisely define what truly matters, any stimulus seems acceptable. The day fills with tasks, commitments, and distractions, but meaning dissolves. Life stays busy yet fragmented. When clarity leaves, vices find an entry point. They don't arrive as dramatic ruptures, but as tolerable escapes. A little more distraction to ease exhaustion, a little less presence to avoid discomfort, a little less conscious effort to avoid facing emptiness. Epictetus observed that it is not events that disturb a man, but how he responds to them. This idea helps explain why two men, exposed to the same environment and pressures, build completely different destinies. One organizes his life with discipline, the other allows himself to be led by impulses. The difference is rarely talent or intelligence. It lies in the ability to govern habits. At this point, discipline stops looking like punishment and reveals its true function. It is not a prison, but protection. Seneca warned that freedom does not consist in doing whatever one wants, but in not becoming a slave to one's desires. When routine lacks minimal structure, immediate pleasure takes command. The result is predictable: scattered energy, unstable focus, and the constant feeling of always being behind in one's own life. Modern studies on habit and consistency confirm this logic. Habits do not require high motivation, only conscious repetition. When a man establishes schedules, limits, and priorities, he reduces the mental wear of constant decision-making. That frees energy for what truly matters: work done well, preserved relationships, and self-care. Discipline, in this sense, does not impoverish life. It sustains it. Emotional maturity begins when a man accepts the weight of his own choices without outsourcing blame. Personal leadership does not depend on position, status, or external recognition. It shows up in how someone takes care of his health, honors commitments, and deals with frustration. Developmental psychologists point out that emotionally mature men do not try to eliminate discomfort at all costs. They learn to move through it responsibly. When the comparison between Solomon and Naval stops being intellectual and becomes practical, the focus shifts. It is no longer about ancient kings or modern thinkers, but about recurring human patterns. Success is no longer measured only by what is achieved, but by what is preserved along the way. Disorganized routines quietly erode achievements. Conscious habits protect what is yet to be built. This mirror does not demand immediate answers. It simply reveals It reveals where there is coherence and where there is avoidance. It reveals whether life is being guided by deliberate choices or repeated impulses. The wealth that endures is born from this silent adjustment between intention and practice. This is where a man stops reacting to the world and gradually begins to lead his own life with steadiness, respect, and direction. When the mirror reveals silent patterns, an unavoidable warning emerges. The problem is not merely seeking success, but ignoring the internal effect it produces. Success is not neutral. It amplifies whatever already exists inside a man. Virtues grow, weaknesses grow as well. This is the point history insists on showing, and many prefer to ignore. Historian Niall Ferguson observes that empires and leaders rarely collapse due to lack of resources, but because of lost internal direction. The same happens at an individual level. When a man rises without clear purpose, success stops being an organizing force and becomes a source of pressure. Expectations rise, responsibilities accumulate, and without self-mastery, wear and tear begins quietly. In this scenario, modern vices appear less as moral failures and more as forms of emotional anesthesia. Pornography, digital games, overeating, and constant stimulation serve as quick relief for a life that has lost meaning. Existential psychology points out that when suffering lacks meaning, humans seek distraction, not to live better, but to feel less. The cost appears later as anxiety, apathy, and a gradual loss of focus. Recent studies on male depression indicate that many men do not collapse because of extreme events, but due to a sequence of small concessions. They sleep poorly, eat without awareness, avoid silence, evade confronting frustration. Over time, the mind loses clarity and the body responds with constant fatigue. External success remains visible, but inner life begins to deteriorate. The root of this process is not ambition itself. Ambition is a natural force. The problem arises when it is disconnected from purpose. Ambition without purpose always demands more stimulation to generate satisfaction. Ambition with purpose, on the other hand, organizes choices and imposes limits. It allows saying no to what weakens in order to protect what builds. This distinction determines whether success becomes support or burden. Existential psychology reinforces that human beings can endure almost any challenge when they understand why. Viktor Frankl demonstrated that the absence of meaning produces more suffering than pain itself. When a man does not know why he works, grows, or struggles, any discomfort becomes unbearable. In that void, distractions take on the role of emotional anesthetics. The central warning, therefore, is clear. It is not the lack of opportunities that silently destroys men, but the lack of direction. Success accelerates this process. It does not create the problem, it exposes it. The greater the external achievement, the greater the need for inner governance. Without it, what should elevate begins to corrode. This understanding leads to a practical conclusion. Recognizing the risk is not enough. Daily protection must be built. Focus, discipline, and clarity do not arise by chance. They require simple strategies applied consistently. Without method, intention dissolves. With method, a man regains direction, reduces internal noise, and transforms growth into something sustainable, capable of preserving health, relationships, and dignity over time. Building true wealth requires method, not momentary inspiration. Solomon and Naval converge on this point. Clarity is born from conscious decision, sustained by daily practice. Without strategy, intention fades. Below are 5 practical and detailed strategies to help you build true wealth. These approaches promise no shortcuts, but offer concrete paths to reclaim focus, discipline, and personal responsibility. All of them start from the same principle. The 21st century man must govern his own mind before trying to expand external results. Each strategy connects ancient wisdom, modern psychology, and practical freedom, turning concepts into repeatable actions capable of reducing anxiety, neutralizing silent vices, and sustaining real growth over time with coherence and consistency. First strategy: define personal wealth in writing. Yes, you need paper and pen to clearly define what wealth means to you. Clarity does not come from vague reflection, but from precise formulation. Cognitive psychologists show that writing reduces mental ambiguity and guides decision-making. Defining wealth includes setting clear limits. How much is enough, what will not be sacrificed, and which values are non-negotiable. Solomon warned that where there is no direction, everything scatters. Naval reinforces that decisions become lighter when objectives are explicit. This practice transforms diffuse desires into concrete criteria, allowing you to evaluate opportunities calmly and avoid paths that generate financial gain but erode inner freedom over time. Second strategy: rebuild a disciplined routine. Discipline starts with the body before the mind. Regular sleep, defined schedules, and periods of deep work restore focus and reduce impulsivity. Attention studies show that fatigue weakens self-control. Naval advocates simple environments for complex decisions. Practices such as brief meditation and conscious pauses train presence. This is not about extreme rigidity, but minimal predictability. A stable routine reduces internal noise, frees cognitive energy, and creates a solid base for professional, family, and financial decisions, even under constant pressure. Third strategy: eliminate stimuli that drain mental energy. Attention is a finite resource. Neuroscience demonstrates that excessive stimulation reduces cognitive depth. Pornography, gaming, and constant notifications fragment focus and amplify anxiety. Elimination does not mean isolation, but conscious choice. Naval argues for reducing inputs to increase clarity. Solomon warned that excess scatters the heart. Practically, this means limiting screens, creating stimulus-free periods, and replacing artificial dopamine with restorative activities. The result is a calmer mind, firmer decisions, and gradual recovery of self-mastery. Fourth strategy: practice action-oriented self-knowledge. Understanding emotions is not enough. They must be corrected. Behavioral psychology recommends simple weekly reviews. What strengthened you, what weakened you, what will be adjusted. This practice turns error into learning. Solomon associated wisdom with inner vigilance. Naval emphasizes radical responsibility. Recording decisions, observing relapses, and adjusting course reduce self-deception. Over time, patterns become visible. Applied self-knowledge builds emotional maturity, strengthens personal leadership, and prevents silent failures from becoming permanent habits. Fifth strategy: think in terms of legacy, not just immediate comfort. Existential psychology shows that meaning sustains effort. Asking what will remain reorganizes priorities. Solomon thought in generations. Naval advocates long-term games. Legacy-oriented decisions favor discipline and limits. This means accepting present discomfort for future benefit. Investing in health, relationships, and competence builds wealth that does not depend on external circumstances. When a man acts with future consequences in mind, anxiety decreases, purpose strengthens, and something enduring is built beyond momentary applause. When observing Solomon and Naval Ravikant, history leaves a clear lesson. Wealth is not what impresses others, but what sustains a man when no one is watching. Money can expand choices, but only self-mastery preserves dignity. In a world addicted to quick pleasure, distraction, and comparison, governing oneself has become a rare and powerful act. It is not success that destroys men, but the lack of clarity about why and for what they are living. True wealth begins when choices become conscious, habits stop sabotaging the future, and discipline becomes an ally rather than an enemy. This path is not easy, but it is solid, and everything that is solid withstands time. If this reflection resonated with you, write in the comments what most steals your clarity today. Subscribe to the channel. Here, the conversation is not about the appearance of success. It is about building a life worth living.